What would you do if the whole town laughed the day you signed your name to $8 worth of ruin? For Etta Mae Kincaid, 19 years old and lately turned out of the only house she'd ever known, this wasn't a question posed in idle company. It was the shape of a Tuesday morning in the autumn of 1897, in a rail yard on the western edge of Colorado Springs, where a rusted boxcar sat off its trucks in the weeds, its wheels gone for scrap, its doors welded shut by weather and, some said, by human hands. The auctioneer had opened the bidding at 50 cents. He had closed it at $8, and the only bidder had been a slim girl in a patched wool coat with a machinist's hammer hanging in a loop at her hip. The men in the yard had whistled through their teeth. One of them said, loud enough for her to hear, that she'd paid $8 for a coffin nobody could open. But there was a secret behind those welded doors, a secret that had been sealed in iron and silence for 36 years, and it would rewrite not only Etta's life but the ledger of a whole town that had already written her off. Settle in, friend, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. To understand why a 19-year-old girl would spend the last of her folding money on a boxcar the whole yard called worthless, you have to go back some ways, back before the auction, back before the $8, back before the black creep on the front door of a small house on Willow Street. You have to go back to a man named Silas Kincaid, and to the shop that stood behind that house, and to the smell of hot iron and coal smoke that Etta would carry in her clothes for the rest of her life. Silas Kincaid had been a railroad machinist for the Denver and Rio Grande before his back gave out, and after that he'd kept a small repair shop where farmers brought broken plowshares and townsfolk brought door hinges that had rusted through, and the sheriff sometimes brought a pair of handcuffs whose lock had jammed on a drunk. He was a widower. He'd been a widower since Etta was 4. He raised the child in the shop the way another man might have raised her in a parlor, and by the time she was 7 she could tell a cold chisel from a hot chisel by the sound they made when they were set down on the anvil. By the time she was 12 she could weld a seam with a forge and a hammer that would hold water. By the time she was 16 she could take apart the coupling of a freight car in the yard and put it back together while the yardmaster smoked a pipe and pretended not to be impressed. Silas taught her 3 things over and over, until they were as much a part of her as the shape of her own hands. The first was that iron remembers. Every hammer strike, every heating, every quenching, every long year of rust, iron remembers all of it, and if you listen with your ears and your palms you can read the story of a piece of metal the way a preacher reads scripture. The second was that a lock is only a puzzle a man made, and any puzzle a man made, another can undo, given time and patience and the right small tool. The third was that a job worth doing is worth doing quiet. He didn't like braggarts. He didn't like men who told you what they were going to do before they did it. He liked the small satisfaction of a thing finished before anyone thought to ask about it. On Etta's 12th birthday he gave her a hammer. It was not a new hammer. It was the hammer he had carried in his own belt loop since he was a boy apprentice in a Pennsylvania rail shop, its hickory handle worn smooth and dark by 40 years of a working man's palm, its head marked SK in 3 small punch strikes near the eye. He told her that a machinist without her own hammer was a person without her own name, and he pressed the tool into her hand and closed her fingers around it. She was small enough then that the weight of it pulled her wrist down. She grew into it. She carried that hammer every day for the next 7 years, hung in a loop she had stitched into the hip of every coat she owned, and she never once set it down on a bench that wasn't level, because Silas had told her that a hammer laid on a slope will roll, and a rolled hammer is a lost hammer, and a lost hammer is a lost trade. Silas Kincaid died on a Sunday morning in March of 1896, of a cough that had been in his chest since Christmas, and Etta was 18 years old and alone in the world save for one man, her father's older brother, Judge Ambrose Kincaid, who was not a judge but had been called that since he'd been made a bank officer at the First Mercantile of Colorado Springs some 30 years before. Ambrose came to the funeral in a black coat and a silk hat and did not sit with Etta at the graveside. He stood at the back with his hat over his heart and his lips pressed thin, and he watched the dirt go into the hole the way a man watches a debt settle on a ledger sheet. He came to the shop the next morning. He did not knock. He walked through the front and past the anvil and stood in the middle of the swept floor with his gloves still on, and he told her that the shop was mortgaged, that the house was mortgaged, that Silas had owed the First Mercantile $1,140 against instruments and lot, and that as executor Ambrose intended to satisfy the debt by taking possession of both. He told her this without raising his voice. He told her the way a man tells you the time. She went to live in his house on North Cascade Avenue in a narrow back room over the kitchen that had once been a maid's room and still smelled faintly of lye soap. His wife, Cordelia, was polite the way a stranger on a train is polite. There were 2 cousins, both younger, both taught to call her Miss Etta and to keep the parlor door closed when she passed. She earned her keep by mending, by scrubbing, by carrying coal up the back stair in a scuttle each morning at 5:30. In the evenings, when the house was quiet, she oiled her hammer with a rag she kept folded in her pocket, and she did not cry, because Silas had taught her that crying was a private business and a house like Ambrose's had no private rooms. She stayed there for 18 months. On the morning of her 19th birthday, in September of 1897, Ambrose called her into his study. He did not wish her a happy birthday. He did not offer her a seat. He opened a black leather ledger on his desk and he ran his finger down a column of small, neat figures, and he told her that the accounting had been done. He told her that Silas Kincaid's estate, after debts and interest and the 18 months of her board and lodging at market rate, came to a positive balance of $14.31. He counted the money out on the desk in front of her. 10 silver dollars, 4 paper ones, 3 dimes, and a penny. He said the words "final settlement," and he closed the ledger. He told her that Cordelia had packed her a valise and that the morning train west was at 10:40. She did not argue. She did not weep. She stood at the desk and she picked up the money and she folded the bills once and put them in the inside pocket of her coat, and she put the coins in a small canvas pouch that her father had given her for keeping tap dies in, and she went upstairs. In the valise Cordelia had packed 2 dresses, a comb, a Bible, a wool shawl, a tin cup, a paper of pins, a spare pair of stockings, a small block of soap, and, at the very bottom, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth, the hammer with the letters SK punched into the head. She lifted it out. She hung it in the loop at her hip. She closed the valise. She walked down the back stair and out the kitchen door and did not look back at the house on North Cascade Avenue, and she did not see it again. What would you have done, in her place, with $14.31 and a hammer and a hard road west? Let us know in the comments what you would have carried, and what you would have left behind. The train she took was not going anywhere in particular. It was going west because west was the direction she was facing when she reached the station, and because the ticket clerk told her that $4 would put her on a slow local that stopped at every water tank and section house between Colorado Springs and Canyon City. She paid the $4. She kept the receipt. She sat by a window on the north side of the car and watched the town of her childhood slide backward past her shoulder, the courthouse, the smokestacks of the smelter, the tall cottonwood by the river where her father had once shown her how to skip a flat stone 6 times across the current. Then the town was gone, and the plain opened out, and the mountains stood up on the west like the wall of a house she had not yet been invited into. She rode for the better part of a day. The land grew drier and higher. The grass went from green to a pale gold that was almost silver where the wind pressed it flat. Antelope stood in pairs at a great distance and did not run. The train stopped at a place called Divide, where a man with a red beard got on with a crate of chickens, and again at a place called Florissant, where nobody got on or off but the fireman came through with a coal bucket and a pleasant word for the ladies. In the late afternoon they crossed a low pass and dropped into a wide bowl of country, and the conductor came down the aisle and said, "Colorado Springs siding, all off for the auction yard," and Etta looked up in surprise, because she had not asked about an auction, and the conductor smiled and said, "Every soul on this train's going to the auction, miss. It's the only reason we run on Tuesdays." She had not planned on an auction. She had planned on Canyon City, and beyond that she had planned on nothing. But she got off with the others, because when a person has $14.31 and no destination, an auction is as good a place to stand as any, and because Silas had always told her that a rail yard was the closest thing to a church a working man was likely to find. She followed the crowd along a cinder path to a fenced lot behind the roundhouse, where a dozen pieces of dead rolling stock had been drawn up in a row like the pews of some strange, ruined chapel. A flat car with a broken stake. A tender with its water tank split down the belly. 2 ore cars. A wooden caboose with its cupola caved in. And at the end of the row, standing off its trucks in the tall dry weeds, one plain freight boxcar, unpainted for so long that the wood had gone the color of a wasp's nest, its iron banding red with rust, and its double doors. This she noticed at once. Welded shut top and bottom with long ugly beads of iron that had been laid down not by any factory but by some hurried hand a long time ago. She stood in front of that car for a full minute before the auctioneer began. Silas would have stood in front of it too. Iron remembers, he had told her. And this iron, she could see even from 6 feet away, remembered something. The auctioneer was a fat man in a checked vest, and he sold off the flat car and the tender and the ore cars and the caboose in about 20 minutes, and when he got to the boxcar he laughed. He actually laughed. He said, "Gentlemen and lady, We come now to lot number 12, which is one Denver and Rio Grande boxcar of the 1861 pattern, retired from service in the year of our Lord 1863, welded shut by parties unknown, contents unknown, and warranted to be, in the exact words of the yardmaster, not worth the powder to blow it open. Do I hear $1? Nobody said $1. He said, do I hear 4 bits? A man in the back said, 4 bits for firewood. The auctioneer said, 6 bits from the gentleman with the wife who don't cook. There was some laughter. Etta raised her hand and said, in a voice that surprised her by carrying $1. The auctioneer looked at her. He looked at the car. He looked back at her. He said, $1 from the young lady in the wool coat. Do I hear 2? A tall man in a fawn-colored suit and a black string tie stepped out from behind the crowd. He was clean-shaven and prosperous-looking, and he wore a heavy gold ring on his little finger. He said, $2. He did not look at Etta. He looked at the boxcar the way a man looks at a woman he already owns. The auctioneer took his bid. Etta bid 3. The tall man bid 4. Etta bid 5. The tall man, without smiling, without so much as a glance at her, bid 7. The crowd went quiet. $7 was more money than any piece of scrap on that lot had brought all afternoon. Etta felt the folded bills in her inside pocket and the coins in the die pouch at her belt. She had $10.31 to her name after the train fare. She bid 8. The tall man stood very still. He looked at her then, for the first time, and there was a small hard calculation in his face, and then he shook his head once, curtly, and stepped back into the crowd. The auctioneer said, $8, going once, going twice, sold, to the young lady with the hammer, for the sum of $8, and God have mercy on her judgment. He struck the block. The crowd laughed. A man near Etta muttered that she had paid $8 for a coffin nobody could open. The tall man in the fawn suit walked away without looking back, and a boy in the yard whispered to her, awed, Miss, that was Mr. Thaddeus Boyle. He owns the smelter and the newspaper and half the water rights in this county. What did he want with an old boxcar? Etta did not answer, because she did not know. But she knew that a man like Thaddeus Boyle did not bid $7 against a 19-year-old girl in a patched coat for nothing. And she knew that iron remembers. She paid her $8 at a plank table, and the clerk gave her a bill of sale on a slip of blue paper that named her as owner of 1D&RG boxcar, retired, contents as is, situated on lot 14 of the west siding, buyer to remove or maintain in place at her own expense within 30 days. She read it twice. She folded it and put it inside her Bible, between Ruth and 1 Samuel, which was where Silas had always told her to keep important papers because thieves, he'd said, will steal a purse before they'll steal a Bible. Then she walked out into the weeds and stood in front of the boxcar that was now hers, and the sun was going down behind the mountains, and the light on the rusted iron was the color of old blood, and she was alone. She was not alone for long. Out of the long shadow of the roundhouse a small bent figure came shuffling toward her, a woman older than seemed possible, wrapped in a black shawl and leaning on a length of pipe that she used for a cane. Her face was as brown and creased as a piece of harness leather, and her eyes were pale, pale blue. She stopped 10 feet from Etta, and she looked at the boxcar, and she looked at Etta, and she said, in a voice like a dry hinge, Child, that car has been waiting a long time for the right hand to knock on it. Mind you don't answer for the wrong one. Then she turned and shuffled off toward town without another word, and Etta stood in the weeds with the words settling on her the way cold settles on iron at dusk, and she did not understand them yet. Have you ever been given a piece of counsel you did not understand until years later? Tell us in the comments about a time a stranger said something to you that turned out to be truer than you knew. She slept that first night in the boxcar. She had nowhere else to sleep, and 30 days was not long, and the $8 she had spent felt suddenly like the whole world. She could not open the doors, the welds were as thick as her thumb and as long as her forearm, and she had neither forge nor cutting torch, but she found a gap under the north end where the car sat crooked on its blocks, and she crawled in on her belly through dust and mouse leavings and came up inside a black, close, iron-smelling dark. She lit a candle stub from her valise. The inside of the car had been swept, once, a very long time ago. There were no crates, no barrels, no visible cargo. There was only, along the back wall, a wooden partition that ran from floor to ceiling, dividing the car into a long room and, behind it, a short room she could not enter, because the partition had no door, only a smooth face of tongue and groove pine, painted a dull red that had gone almost black, and nailed, she saw when she brought the candle close, with square-cut nails of a kind that had not been made in any American mill since the war. She sat with her back against the partition and she ate a heel of bread from her valise and she drank water from her tin cup and she listened. Iron remembers, Silas had said. Wood remembers too, if you know how to listen. She rapped the partition with her knuckles. It sounded hollow. She rapped the floor. It sounded solid. She rapped the outer wall of the car. It sounded like what it was, old planking over an iron frame. She rapped the partition again, in 3 places, and each time it answered her with the same small hollow breath, and she smiled for the first time in 18 months, because a hollow wall in a welded car is not nothing. A hollow wall in a welded car is a puzzle a man made. And any puzzle a man made, another can undo. She blew out the candle and she slept sitting up with her hammer across her lap and her hand on the head of it, the way a soldier sleeps with a rifle, and she dreamed of her father standing at the forge with his sleeves rolled and saying, without turning around, "Listen to it, girl. It's telling you where." She woke at first light. She crawled out under the north end. She walked into town. Colorado Springs proper was 2 miles east of the yard, but there was a smaller settlement of section men and yard hands just across the tracks, a place called Bijou, with a store and a smith and a boarding house and not much else. She spent 40 cents of her remaining $2.31 on a loaf of bread, a wedge of cheese, a paper of matches, a tin of lamp oil, and a used file. She spent nothing on lodging. She walked back to the yard. For the next 11 days she lived in and around that boxcar, and the men in the yard watched her the way men watch weather. They did not offer help, at first, because they did not think she'd last. They saw a slim girl in a patched coat crawl under a boxcar at dawn with a hammer and a file and crawl out at dusk with her hands black and her hair full of rust, and they made bets among themselves as to which day she'd give up and take the train back east. She did not give up. What she did was work. She could not break the welds from the outside, she did not have the tools, so she worked from the inside, on the partition, because the partition was pine, and pine is a wood a machinist's daughter knows how to persuade. She could not simply smash the partition, because Silas had taught her that a man who smashes a puzzle destroys the answer along with the lock. She had to read it first. She spent a whole day with a candle and her hand flat against the boards, running her palm over every inch of the painted pine, feeling for the small betrayals, a nail head slightly proud, a seam slightly wider, a grain that ran the wrong way. On the second day she found what she was looking for. 4 boards, near the middle of the partition, whose grain did not match the boards on either side. Their grain ran vertical where the others ran horizontal. Someone had cut a panel and set it back in and painted over it, and the paint had aged with the rest, and to a careless eye it was invisible. To Etta's hand, once she knew to look, it was as loud as a shout. She worked those 4 boards for 3 more days. She could not use the hammer, because the hammer would ring in the iron car like a bell and bring every yard hand at a run. She used the file, patiently, quietly, drawing it along the seams to eat away the old paint and the old glue, and when she had exposed the join she used the tang of the file as a pry bar, and she worked each nail out of its hole the way her father had shown her to work a broken key out of a lock, slowly, with respect for the wood around it, so that when the panel came free it would come free clean. Her hands blistered and the blisters broke and the broken blisters bled and the blood dried black on the file and she kept working. She ate her bread. She drank her water. She slept sitting up. On the 6th night the old woman with the pipe cane came again, in the dark, and stood outside the boxcar and said nothing, only left a covered tin plate on a rail tie where Etta would find it in the morning, beans and salt pork and a piece of cornbread the size of Etta's fist. On the 8th day the smith from Bijou walked over on his dinner hour with a small can of penetrating oil and set it on the rail tie without a word and walked back. On the 10th day a carpenter named Wills, whose name she did not yet know, came by after supper and, without asking, spent an hour replumbing the blocks under the north end of the car so that it would not shift while she worked inside it, and he tipped his hat to her when he was done and said only, "You'll want it steady," and walked off into the dusk. None of them asked her what she was doing. None of them asked her what she hoped to find. They watched her keep her head down and her hands moving, and they answered her competence with competence, which is the highest form of kindness a working town knows how to give. On the 11th day, in the middle of the afternoon, the 4 boards came free. She lifted them out one by one and laid them on the floor of the car in the same order they had come from the wall, because Silas had taught her that a thing worth taking apart is worth being able to put back together. Then she raised her candle to the opening. Behind the partition was a room. It was perhaps 6 feet long and the full width of the car, and it had been made with care. The walls were lined with tarred canvas to keep out damp. The floor was covered with a Navajo blanket that had gone the color of old ash but was still whole. Against the far wall stood a small folding camp desk of the kind officers had carried in the war, and on the desk sat a tin lamp, a leather-bound journal, an inkwell dried to a black scab, and a pen. Along one side wall, stacked neatly, were 3 small wooden strongboxes, each about the size of a family Bible, each padlocked. Along the other side wall, on a narrow shelf, sat a row of objects that made Etta's breath catch: a folded blue army coat, a pair of eyeglasses in a case, a tortoiseshell comb, a woman's small daguerreotype in a hinged brass frame, and, at the end of the shelf, a single small carving in soft yellow pine of a sparrow with its wings half raised, no bigger than her thumb. The sort of thing a man makes for a child who has asked him what a bird looks like when it is about to fly. In the middle of the desk, held down by a smooth river stone, was a sealed envelope. The wax was dark red. The words on the front were written in a spidery, careful hand, and they read, "To whoever finds this. Read before you take anything else." She sat down on the blanket. She did not touch the strongboxes. She did not touch the coat or the comb or the daguerreotype. She lifted the stone off the envelope and she broke the wax and she unfolded the letter and she read it by the light of her candle, slowly, twice, and this is what it said. "To whoever finds this, I write these lines in the last week of August, in the year 1861, in the 12th car of a special freight of the Denver and Rio Grande, standing at present on a siding at Colorado Springs. My name is Joshua Merritt. I am paymaster to the 3rd Regiment of Colorado Volunteers, and I am carrying in the strongboxes at my back the sum of $19,420 in United States gold coin, being the payroll of the regiment for the summer quarter, together with a small further sum of $1,100 in silver which is my own, saved these 15 years against a purpose I shall shortly explain. I am a dead man as I write this. I am not yet dead in body, but I have been these 3 days coughing blood into a rag, and the surgeon at Camp Weld has told me plainly that I shall not see September. My orders were to accompany this payroll to Denver and see it distributed to the men. I shall not reach Denver. I have therefore, with the help of a carpenter whose name I will not set down, caused a partition to be built into this car and the doors to be welded from the outside by a smith at Bijou who believes he is sealing a shipment of quarantine goods, and I have laid myself down in this small room with my ledgers and my lamp and the little I own, to finish what accounting a man can finish before the Lord calls him in. The $19,420 in the 2 larger boxes is the property of the United States and of the men of the 3rd Colorado. See that they are paid. I have written in the journal on this desk the name of every man, his rank, his company, and the sum owed him to the cent. Do not keep this money. It belongs to men who slept in mud for it. The $1,100 in the smaller box is mine, and I give it, together with everything else in this room and the car itself, to whoever has the wit and the patience and the honest hand to find it. I ask 3 things in return. First, that you see the men are paid, as I could not. Second, that you take from the shelf the small carving of a sparrow, which I made with a pocket knife for my daughter Anna, who was 6 years old when the fever took her in the spring of 1859, and that you keep it, because a thing carved in love should not be left in the dark. Third, that you use what is left to make some place in this country live again, some place that has been given up on, as I was given up on by the surgeon and as this car will be given up on by the yard. I have seen too much given up on in my life. I would like to leave behind one thing that was not. My wife Mary died with Anna in the same week. There is a small daguerreotype of them on the shelf. If you have a place to set it where the light will fall on it kindly, I would be obliged. I have no other people left in the world. God be with you, whoever you are. Use it well. Joshua Merritt, Paymaster, 3rd Colorado Volunteers, August 27, 1861. Etta read the letter twice. Then she folded it very carefully along its old creases and she put it back inside its envelope and she set the envelope on the desk and she set the river stone on top of it, exactly where it had been. She sat on the ash-colored blanket in the small tarred room with the candle guttering on the desk beside her and she did not weep, because Silas had taught her that weeping was a private business, but she put her hand over her mouth and she stayed that way for a long time. 36 years, she thought. He had been in this room, alone, for 36 years. And Thaddeus Boyle had bid $7 against her that morning at the block. She stayed in the boxcar 3 more days before she told a living soul what she had found. In those 3 days she did 4 things. She read the journal every page, every name, every rank, every sum, and she found the total agreed with the letter to the penny. She counted, with the smallest and quietest of pry bars, the contents of the 2 large strongboxes, and the coin agreed with the ledger to the coin. She took down the daguerreotype of Mary and Anna Merritt from the shelf, and she cleaned the glass with the corner of her shawl, and she stood it up on the desk where the candle would fall on it kindly. And she took the small pine sparrow from the end of the shelf, and she wrapped it in her handkerchief, and she put it in the inside pocket of her coat next to the folded bill of sale, because Joshua Merritt had asked her to, and because she had said yes in her heart the first time she read the letter. On the 4th morning she walked into Bijou, and she went first not to the sheriff and not to the newspaper and not to the bank, but to the smith who had left the can of oil on the rail tie. His name was Amos Cleary. She told him what she had found, in plain words, without embroidery, and she showed him the letter, and he read it standing up in his leather apron with his hands still black from the forge. When he had finished he handed the letter back to her, and he wiped his eyes once with the back of his wrist, and he said, "Miss Kincaid, what would you have me do?" She said, "I need the welds cut from the doors. I need it done at first light tomorrow, before Mr. Boyle hears of it. And I need 2 honest witnesses when the doors come open, because I do not intend that any man shall ever say I took a coin that was not left to me." Amos Cleary said, "You'll have 3. He named the carpenter Wills, and a Methodist minister from Bijou called Reverend Hollis, and himself. He would not take pay. He said, "A man that welded that door in 1861 was covering for a dying man. I'll not charge his ghost for the cutting of it." They cut the welds at dawn the next morning. The doors screamed on their hinges when they opened, and half the yard came running at the sound, and among the first to come running was Thaddeus Boyle in his fawn-colored suit, and behind him, in a black carriage that had been sent for its speed, came Judge Ambrose Kincaid of the First Mercantile Bank of Colorado Springs, because word had reached him overnight from a clerk in Bijou that his niece had bought a boxcar and was cutting it open at first light, and Ambrose Kincaid had not become what he was by ignoring news of that kind. They arrived to find Etta standing in the open doorway of the car with a letter in her hand, and Reverend Hollis at her right shoulder and Amos Cleary at her left, and the carpenter Wills sitting on the rail tie writing down every item, every coin, every name, in a clean-bound book. She looked down at Thaddeus Boyle from the door of the car, and she said, in a voice quiet enough that the men had to hush to hear her, "Mr. Boyle, I understand you bid on this car yesterday. I would be obliged if you would tell these gentlemen what you knew about it, and how long you have known it." He did not answer her. He looked at the letter in her hand, and then he looked at her face, and then he turned on his heel and walked away, and he did not stop walking until he reached his carriage, and within the week he had sold his interest in the smelter and left the county, and within the month the Denver papers had printed the story of a paymaster's grandson in his employ who had told him, 30 years back, of a boxcar sealed at Colorado Springs, and of a long slow patient effort to make sure that car was never sold to anyone but himself. He was never charged with a crime. He did not need to be. He was undone the moment Etta Mae Kincaid stood in the door of the car with the letter in her hand. As for Judge Ambrose Kincaid, he stood at the edge of the crowd, and he watched his niece read Joshua Merritt's letter aloud, in her quiet steady voice, from beginning to end, so that every man in the yard heard the name of every soldier owed his pay in the summer of 1861, and he heard her say, when she finished, that the $19,420 in government gold would be turned over that afternoon to the office of the United States Marshal at Denver, together with the paymaster's ledger, and that any surviving man of the 3rd Colorado or any lawful heir of any deceased man might apply to that office for what was owed. And Ambrose Kincaid heard her say, further, that the $1,100 of Joshua Merritt's private savings, together with the boxcar and its remaining contents, was hers by the paymaster's own hand, and that she intended to use it, as he had asked, to make some place in the country live again. Ambrose Kincaid opened his mouth once as if to speak, and closed it, and got back into his carriage, and drove away. And Etta did not raise her voice to him, and she did not need to, then or ever after. The money went to Denver by armed escort within the week. Within 6 months the War Department had traced and paid out, in full, 142 of the 171 men on Joshua Merritt's ledger, and to the heirs of most of the rest. There is, in the Colorado State Archives at Denver, a bound volume of receipts on that account, and Etta Mae Kincaid's name is written on the flyleaf of it, in a clean small hand, as the person by whose act the debt was discharged. The $1,100 she used, as she had promised, to make a place live again. She bought, for $200, the tumble-down machine shop at Bijou that Amos Cleary had been renting for 12 years and could not afford to purchase. She put it in Amos's name and hers together, half and half, and she rebuilt the roof herself, and she brought the boxcar down onto new blocks behind the shop and turned it into her own small workroom, with a bench along one wall and a rack of tools along the other, and Joshua Merritt's folding desk kept where he had left it, and the daguerreotype of Mary and Anna Merritt standing on the desk where the morning light fell on it kindly through the open door. She hired the carpenter Wills at a fair wage to build a boarding house next door for the section men, 3 stories, 12 rooms, a kitchen with a proper range. She paid the widow who had brought her the tin plate of beans, her name was Mrs. Delia Ord, to run the kitchen at a share of the profit, and Mrs. Ord ran it until she died 9 years later at the age of 81, and the coffee she made at 5 each morning was, according to every man who ever drank it, the best coffee between Denver and Pueblo. Reverend Hollis got a new roof on his chapel, paid for out of a small anonymous fund at the First National Bank of Denver, which was not the First Mercantile of Colorado Springs, and which Etta had chosen for that reason. A year to the day after she had signed her name to a blue slip of paper for one boxcar, contents unknown, she was standing in the doorway of the Kincaid and Cleary Machine Works at Bijou, Colorado, at the hour of dusk, with a mug of Mrs. Ord's coffee in her hand and the smell of hot iron and coal smoke coming out of the shop behind her, when she reached into the inside pocket of her coat and took out 2 objects and laid them side by side on the flat top of a barrel by the door. The first was the hammer with the letters SK punched 3 times near the eye of the head, its hickory handle a shade darker now with a year of her own palm added to 40 of her father's. The second was the small pine sparrow, no bigger than her thumb, its wings half raised, carved by a dying paymaster in a sealed boxcar in the summer of 1861 for a 6-year-old daughter who had died 2 years before he did. She looked at them a long time. Her father had given her a trade, and a way of listening to iron, and a hammer to lay quiet on a level bench. Joshua Merritt had given her a ledger to settle, and a town to raise up, and a sparrow to keep out of the dark. She was 20 years old that evening. She had been cast out, a year and a day before, with $14.31 to her name and a hammer at her hip, and she had spent 8 of those dollars on a boxcar nobody could open, and she had opened it, and she was standing now in the door of her own shop with the coal smoke in her hair and a town at her back that had learned, one competence at a time, to call her by her name. She put the sparrow back in her inside pocket, where it would ride against her heart. She hung the hammer in the loop at her hip, where it would ride against her hip bone. She drank the last of Mrs. Ord's coffee, and she went back inside, to bank the forge for the night, because a job worth doing is worth doing quiet, and there was another day coming in the morning. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this story of patience and quiet justice. If you were moved by Etta Mae Kincaid's journey, by a 19-year-old girl who paid $8 for a rusted boxcar and let a dead man's letter make her rich in ways money alone could never buy, please give this video a like and share it with someone who has ever been handed a worthless thing by a world too hurried to look twice. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell, so you won't miss our next tale from the long roads and small towns of the American West. Next Tuesday, we'll tell you the story of a widow in the Dakota Territory who was left, in 1889, one broken threshing machine and a locked steamer trunk her husband had forbidden her to open, and what she found under the false bottom of that trunk on the 3rd night of her widowhood. Until then, friend, be well. And ask yourself, before you sleep tonight, what have you been given in your own life that the world called worthless, and what might it hold, if you had the patience to listen to it the way Etta listened to that iron in the weeds? Let us know in the comments. We read every one.